Dr. John Lott from the Crime Prevention Research Center testified before the House last week and said, may look like a good idea, but it won't do anything. John writes that the NRA has been demonized by the media and Democrats for not getting this research done. They cite the Dickey Amendment, which says no money can be used to promote gun control by the CDC. And that's where I want to welcome in our next guest, my good friend, Dr. John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. Doctor, always good to see you.
Great to talk to you again.
All right, so John, talk to me about this. Now, the Democrats, this always scares me. They want to appropriate $50 million to look at the public health aspects of gun ownership, gun violence, gun control. But you combine that with that H.R. 1112, where they want these draconian 10 to 20-day waiting periods for which background checks to be completed to buy firearms. When you put these two things together, John, it sure looks a lot to me like they're looking for numerous ways and numerous arbitrary ways within that 10 or 20-day waiting period to deny law-abiding Americans their right to own a firearm. Am I just being alarmist here, or is there something to that?
I think generally the different types of gun control laws that are being pushed are just trying to find ways to make it costly or difficult for law-abiding citizens to go and get guns. I mean, the other bill that they passed, these so-called universal background checks on the private transfer of guns. In Washington, D.C., to do a private transfer, the place where they're voting on this, it costs $125 to do a private transfer on a gun. It may not stop you or I from getting a gun, but the very people that my research indicates who benefit the most from owning a gun, poor minorities, particularly blacks who live in high-crime urban areas, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, $125 can make a difference between whether or not they're legally able to go and buy a gun or not.
It's a great point, John. That's a really good point. We don't talk enough about the people who most need guns, right? Those inner city, typically African-American, Hispanic families in those high crime areas, like the one I policed, the NYPD, when I was with the NYPD, can't get a gun in New York City. But now in cities like Chicago, Illinois is now a shell issue state, a little bit easier to get that concealed weapons license. St. Louis, Missouri gun laws are pretty good. You're right. Look down in Florida, where I live, which has some pretty advantageous gun laws for the public. It still costs, I don't know, runs me about $165, $162 to get a concealed weapons license. Then you got to go buy the gun, right? The gun's $500. If you want to buy the gun from another gun shop and have it shipped, it's another $25, $30 fee to have the federal firearms licensee transfer it to you. It's about $1,000, a little under $1,000 hit for that first-time gun buyer that wants to legally carry that weapon. That's, like you say, cost prohibitive for many inner-city people.
Right. Well, in Illinois, you mentioned Chicago. It costs $450 to go through the process to get a permit there. I mean, that really is prohibitive when you start talking about that.
Sure is.
And there are other problems with it, too. I mean, the background checks, they talk now about 3.5 million denials. What they should say, or to prohibited people, what they should say is that there have been 3.5 million initial denials, and that's something like 99% of those were mistakes, where law-abiding citizens, particularly minorities, were stopped from buying guns. But, this other regulation that you're talking about with 10 days or so allowing for background checks, that's based on a myth itself. It was closing the so-called Charleston loophole, where an individual, Dylan Roof, who had done the church shooting down there, had been arrested for a drug offense, for possessing drugs. And they say that if more time had been allowed, he would have been caught and realized that he was prohibited, whereas he wasn't. He was, if you're arrested but haven't been convicted yet, but could be convicted of a penalty that would be at least 2 years in prison, then you're prohibited from buying a gun, even though you haven't been convicted yet. In his case, the worst that he would have gotten would have been 6 months in prison. So
it was a misdemeanor drug case. I want to clarify that for the viewers. So what Dr. Lott is saying is that the way the current system exists, if someone is arrested for an offense, and that offense could potentially carry up to 2 years in prison, over 2 years in prison, they'll be excluded. They'll be denied a firearms purchase on that background check. But Dylan Roof, the Charleston killer, was only arrested for a misdemeanor drug violation. He might very well have been acquitted on it, or it had been pled out. So his constitutional rights, and it pains me to say it, this is a terrible guy. I see him as a domestic terrorist. But
Right.
his constitutional rights were left intact. He could buy a gun. See, John, that's my biggest problem, though, that the Democrats like to seize on these anecdotal incidents, and they're as tragic as they come. No one's going to deny the tragedy of the Charleston shooting or the Parkland shooting. But I don't believe in punishing 100+ million law-abiding Americans for the reprehensible, the tragic actions of statistically a very few. That's where I think the feelings into public policy infusion becomes very dangerous.
Right. It's even worse than that in the sense that if they had made this change in the law, it still wouldn't have stopped Dylan Roof from getting the gun.
Exactly.
And so the only people that would stop are other people, but they're using his case to go and justify this change. The same thing with these background checks, these universal background checks. When they introduced it in January, they brought out Gabby Giffords, the congresswoman who had been injured 8 years earlier in the shooting in Arizona. A tragic case. But if the law had been in effect at that time, it wouldn't have stopped her shooting. It wouldn't have stopped any of the mass public shootings this century. And yet it's framed in the debate constantly as being the solution for going and stopping mass public shootings. I just wish once or twice the media, when they would have these people on who are advocating these laws, just to ask them, name me one mass public shooting this century. Since you're bringing this up as a solution to these, just name me one that would have been stopped as a result of these laws.
John, you're up on Capitol Hill all the time. I mean, you speak to these members of Congress, both in their offices and these committees on the floor. They know that they're spreading disinformation. They know they're being dishonest to the American people when they use these cases, right?
Right. The people I talk to understand that. But unfortunately, I don't think too many of the Democrats understand that. I mean, look, I was just at a hearing this last week for this $50 million. And you'd hear claims from researchers who are testifying, oh, we have no money being given to us. The thing is, over the last 4 years, the federal government alone has put in $43 million into this public health type research.
Right.
Beyond that, you have hundreds of millions of dollars that Bloomberg is putting in. You have the RAND Corporation is putting in apparently up to $50 million into this type of research. You have other groups. George Soros has set up something called Fund for a Safer Future, where they have something like $16 million.
Wow.
You have 23 large foundations that President Obama, when he was president, helped put together that are going to be funding this type of research.
So there are hundreds of millions of dollars already going into these anti-gun initiatives. They don't need another $50 million in taxpayer money, is what you're saying.
Right. It's, you hear them claiming poverty, that they just don't have any resources to go and do the research, and it's just simply not true.
Dr. John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. Always love to talk to you about these issues, John. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me on. Good talking to you.